Hi, this is Mrs. Bohanan. I will be reading for you today A Bear Called Paddington by Michael Bond, Chapter 5. Chapter 5, Paddington and the Old Master. Paddington soon settled down and became one of the family. In fact, in no time at all, it was difficult to imagine what life had been like without him. He made himself useful about the house, and the days passed quickly. The Browns lived near the Portobello Road, where there was a big market, and quite often, when Mrs. Brown was busy, she let him go out to do the shopping for her. Mr. Brown made a shopping trolley for him, an old basket on wheels with a handle for steering it. Paddington was a good shopper and soon became well known to all the traders in the market. He was very thorough, and took the job of shopping seriously. He would press the fruit to see that it had the right degree of firmness, as Mrs. Bird had shown him, and he was always on the lookout for bargains. He was a popular bear with the traders, and most of them went out of their way to save the best things of the day for him. That bear gets more for his 10 pence than anyone I know," said Mrs. Bird. "I don't know how he gets away with it, really I don't. It must be the mean streak in him." "I'm not mean," said Paddington indignantly. "I'm just careful, that's all." "Whatever it is," replied Mrs. Bird, "you're worth your weight in gold." Paddington took this remark very seriously and spent a long time weighing himself on the bathroom scales. Eventually, he decided to consult his friend, Mr. Gruber, on the subject. Now, Paddington spent a lot of his time looking in shop windows, and of all the windows in the Portobello Road, Mr. Gruber's was the best. For one thing, it was nice and low, so that he could look in without having to stand on tiptoe. And for another, it was full of interesting things: old pieces of furniture, medals, pots and pans, pictures. There were so many things it was difficult to get inside the shop. And old Mr. Gruber spent a lot of his time sitting in a deck chair on the pavement. Mr. Gruber, in his turn, found Paddington very interesting, and soon they had become great friends. Paddington often stopped there on his way home from a shopping expedition, and they spent many hours discussing South America, where Mr. Gruber had been when he was a boy. Mr. Gruber usually had a bun and a cup of cocoa in the morning for what he called his elevensies, and he had taken to sharing it with Paddington. "There's nothing like a nice chat over a bun and a cup of cocoa," he used to say, and Paddington, who liked all three, agreed with him, even though the cocoa did make his whiskers go a funny color. Paddington always was interested in bright things, and he had consulted Mr. Gruber one morning on the subject of his Peruvian centavos. He had an idea in the back of his mind that if they were worth a lot of money, he could perhaps sell them and buy a present for the Browns. The £1 a week pocket money Mr. Brown gave him was nice, but by the time he had bought some buns on a Saturday morning, there wasn't much left. After a great deal of consideration, Mr. Gruber had advised Paddington to keep the coins. "It's not always the brightest things that fetch the most money, Mr. Brown," he had said. Mr. Gruber always called Paddington Mr. Brown, and it made him feel important. He had taken Paddington into the back of the shop where his desk was, and from a drawer he had taken a cardboard box full of old coins. They had been rather dirty and disappointing. "See these, Mr. Brown?" he had said. "These are what they call sovereigns. You wouldn't think they were very valuable to look at them, but they are. They're made of gold, and they're worth 50 pounds each. That's more than 100 pounds for an ounce. If you ever find any of those, just you bring them to me." One day, having weighed himself carefully on the scales, Paddington hurried round to Mr. Gruber, taking with him a piece of paper from his scrapbook covered with mysterious calculations. After a big meal on a Sunday, Paddington had discovered he weighed nearly 16 pounds. That was, he looked at his piece of paper again as he neared Mr. Gruber's shop. That was nearly 260 ounces, which meant he was worth nearly 26,000 pounds. Mr. Gruber listened carefully to all that Paddington had to tell him, and then closed his eyes and thought for a moment. He was a kindly man, and he didn't want to disappoint Paddington. "I've no doubt," he said at last, "that you're worth that. You're obviously a very valuable young bear. I know it. Mr. and Mrs. Brown know it. Mrs. Bird knows it. But do other people?" He looked at Paddington over his glasses. "Things aren't always what they seem to be in this world, Mr. Brown," he said sadly. Paddington sighed. It was very disappointing. "I wish they were," he said. "It would be nice." "Perhaps," said Mr. Gruber mysteriously. "Perhaps. But we shouldn't have any nice surprises then, should we?" He took Paddington into his shop after offering him a seat and disappeared for a moment. When he returned, he was carrying a large picture of a boat. At least half of it was a boat. The other half seemed to be the picture of a lady in a large hat. "There you are," he said proudly. "That's what I mean by things not always being what they seem. I'd like your opinion on it, Mr. Brown." Paddington felt rather flattered, but also puzzled. The picture didn't seem to be one thing or the other, and he said so. "Ah," said Mr. Gruber delightedly, "it isn't at the moment, but just you wait until I have cleaned it. I gave 50 pence for that picture years and years ago, when it was just a picture of a sailing ship. And what do you think? When I started to clean it the other day, all the paint began to come off, and I discovered there was another painting underneath." He looked around and then lowered his voice. "Nobody else knows," he whispered. "But I think the painting underneath may be valuable. It may be what they call an old master." And here's a picture of Paddington looking at that picture that Mr. Brown was, or not Mr. Brown, that Mr. Gruber was showing him. Seeing that Paddington still looked puzzled, he explained to him that in the old days, when artists ran short of money and couldn't afford any canvas to paint on, they sometimes painted on top of old pictures, and sometimes, very occasionally, they painted them on top of pictures by artists who afterwards became famous, and whose pictures were worth a lot of money. But as they had been painted over, no one knew anything about them. "It all sounds very complicated," said Paddington thoughtfully. Mr. Gruber talked for a long time about painting, which was one of his favorite subjects. But Paddington, though he was usually interested in anything Mr. Gruber had to tell him, was hardly listening. Eventually, refusing Mr. Gruber's offer of a second cup of cocoa, he slipped down off the chair and began making his way home. He raised his hat automatically whenever anyone said good day to him, but there was a faraway expression in his eyes. Even the smell of buns from the bakery passed unheeded. Paddington had an idea. When he got home, he went upstairs to his room and lay on the bed for a long while staring up at the ceiling. He was up there so long that Mrs. Bird became quite worried and poked her head around the door to know if he was all right. "Quite all right, thank you," said Paddington distantly. "I'm just thinking." Mrs. Bird closed the door and hurried downstairs to tell the others. Her news had a mixed reception. "I don't mind him just thinking," said Mrs. Brown, with a worried expression on her face. "It's when he actually thinks of something that the trouble starts." But she was in the middle of her housework and soon forgot the matter. Certainly, both she and Mrs. Bird were much too busy to notice the small figure of a bear creeping cautiously in the direction of Mr. Brown's shed a few minutes later. Nor did they see him returned, armed with a bottle of Mr. Brown's paint remover and a large pile of rags. Had they done so, they might have good cause to worry, and if Mrs. Brown had seen him creeping on tiptoe into the drawing room, closing the door carefully behind him, she wouldn't have had a minute's peace. And here Paddington is coming back from the shed with the paint remover. Do you think he might be anticipating trying to remove that top layer of the painting to see if there's a precious painting underneath that might be worth more money? That's kind of what I'm thinking. Fortunately, everyone was much too busy to notice any of these things. Even more fortunately, no one came into the drawing room for quite a long while because Paddington was in a mess. Things hadn't gone at all according to plan. He was beginning to wish he had listened more carefully to the things Mr. Gruber had said on the subject of cleaning paintings. To start with, even though he had used almost half a bottle of Mr. Brown's paint remover, the picture had only come off in patches. Secondly, and what was even worse, where it had come off, there was nothing underneath, only the white canvas. Paddington stood back and surveyed his handiwork. Originally, it had been a painting of a lake with a blue sky and several sailing boats dotted around. Now, it looked like a storm at sea. All the boats had gone, and the sky was a funny shade of gray, and half the lake had disappeared. What a good thing I found this old box of paints, he thought as he stood back holding the end of a brush at paw's length and squinting at it as he had once seen a real artist do. Holding a palette in his left paw, he squeezed some red paint onto it and then splotched it about with the brush. He looked nervously over his shoulder and then dabbed some of it on the canvas. Here he is painting. It looks like to me he's trying to paint back what he took off. Paddington had found the paints in a cupboard under the stairs, a whole box of them. There were reds and greens and yellows and blues. In fact, there were so many different colors it was difficult to know which to choose first. He wiped the brush carefully on his hat and then tried another color and then another. It was all so interesting that he thought he would try a bit of each. And he very soon forgot the fact that he was supposed to be painting a picture. In fact, it was more of a design than a picture, with lines and circles and crosses in all different colors. Even Paddington was startled when he finally stepped back to examine it. Of the original picture, there was no trace at all. Rather sadly, he put the tubes of paint back into the box and wrapped the picture in a canvas bag, leaning it against the wall, exactly as he had found it. He decided reluctantly to have another try later on. Painting was fun while it lasted, but it was much more difficult than it looked. He was very silent all through dinner that evening. He was so silent that several times Mrs. Brown asked him how he was, until eventually Paddington asked to be excused and went upstairs. Do you think he was feeling a little guilty that maybe he kind of ruined the painting and he wasn't telling anybody about it? I think maybe that's what happened. "I do hope he's all right, Henry," she said after he had gone. "He hardly touched his dinner, and that is so unlike him.